So as I just said, we've just created one enemy. What we didn't want to force you guys to do is to repeat all of those steps again to make a fairly identical enemy. Instead, what we want to do is show you how you can use some of the things that you've just done, such as the animator controller, for example, and reuse that on a new enemy. So what we did was we very kindly gone and created for you the Zombear, a new enemy who is otherwise pretty identical to the Zombunny. He looks like this. So what we're going to do is to assign certain things to that Zombear to make him work very much in the same way as the Zombunny.
Also, be sure that you've selected, or you're looking at the Zombear in the prefabs folder and not in the models folder, right?
Yes, that's
we have the
very
models characters folder that's got the Zombunny, Zombear, and all that stuff. We're looking in the prefabs folder, which is the prefab that is basically exactly like we've done with the Zombunny. We just went through the steps again so you guys don't have to.
So the great thing about the Unity animator system is that it's reusable. So these are states that have animation clips assigned to them. So when we look at the animator for our, and you guys don't need to do this, I'm just going to show you real quick. For our enemy AC, there it is. We have a bunch of different states. We have move, idle, and death. Now these states aren't the clips themselves, they are holders for clips. So those animations are set up in there, and if you've got something that has a similar skeleton, like our Zombunny and Zombear do, we can reuse this state machine and reuse both the script that talks to these parameters and the parameters themselves in order to drive a different enemy. So in the prefabs, with my Zombear selected, what I'm going to do is click on my animation folder and then drag and drop enemy AC onto the animator controller property. So I'm dropping it onto this. Currently it says none. So we made enemy AC earlier for the other character. We're reusing it here so it will work in exactly the same way. You'll also notice it's got the same scripts applied to it. It's got enemy attack, health, and movement, which remember are looking for this animator controller and looking for the parameters that we set up. So that's just going to work right off the bat. Now, we also have a third type of enemy, which is called the elephant.
Right, let's show them what we got so far.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
That's the next one.
Okay, cool. So just to reiterate that last point, we have a Zombear. He's very much the same as our Zombunny. He has the same rig. So when we created this asset, it's rigged the same way, and that means that we can apply animation. It will look and behave the same as the Zombunny. So what we've done is to expand the Zombear's animator component, and we've dragged and dropped the same enemy AC that we made for the bunny onto the controller for the bear. So it's going to behave in exactly the same way. Then the third enemy is our elephant. He rather shockingly looks like this.
Evil Charlie Brown.
Yeah, evil Charlie Brown elephant. So the difference with this guy is that he's not the same type of enemy. I mean, it's obvious he looks different, but also he's a different shape and his rig's different and his animations are different. However, he does the same things. He has move, he idles, and he has death, but they're not the same animation clips. So one way to approach this would be to make a brand new animator controller, make the transitions, make new parameters for it, and set it up in a fairly similar way.
You could also, in the operating system, copy, paste, create a copy of it. Again, it's redundant and completely unnecessary.
Yeah, so we don't want to do this. So there's a new feature fairly recently added called animator override controllers. So basically what this means is you can create lots of different, effectively, classes of characters in your game. And if, for example, they all share a similar skeleton, you can have the same state machine driving all of them, but just change the animation clips that it uses. So we're going to create that asset. So if you click on the animation folder in your project and go to create, you will see something called animator override controller. Click on this, and we're going to call this elephant. The name isn't that important if you don't want to spell elephant. AOC, Animator Override Controller. You'll notice that the icon is a little different from the others. The others have 3 squares and a play icon. This has a plus icon because it's effectively taking the same state machine and adding over the top the ability to use different clips within the states. So one example for this could be that you have, say you've got a character that runs a certain way and jumps a certain way, but when he shoots or when he attacks, it's totally different. So you use the same animator controller to drive the running and the jumping, etc., but then you just override the attack. So we're going to override all 3 simply because we're reusing the same parameters and the same transitions. So the way that we use this is that we select the asset in the project panel like it is now, and we give it a controller to relate to. So we drag and drop enemy AC onto the controller slot at the top of the inspector. So what this does is it goes through and it says, okay, well, what states does this animator controller have? And it's found move, idle, and death. Then we have the ability to fill in new animation clips to replace the ones that are in those existing states. So the animations, just like before, are within the character folder. So just a word of warning here, what we don't want to do is click off Elephant. So I'm going to click on characters, and I'm going to click on the arrow for Elephant. I'm not going to select it, because we don't want the inspector to start showing something else. We could lock the inspector, but I'm not going to do that right now. So I'm going to go and drag move onto the move slot. I'm going to drag idle onto idle, and death onto death. So effectively we've got the same states, the same state machine, the same logic for how he's going to behave, but the animation clips within each state are being overridden, being replaced by these animation clips from the model. So the animation for that character was done within that model. The rig doesn't have to be shared, but we can replace the animation with whatever we need. Then we're going to go,
You're ahead, but go to just do this last part, and then we can show 2 slides.
Okay. So the last step then is to go to our prefab of the elephant with all of the scripts set up, and just instead of dragging on the enemy AC, we're going to drag on the override controller into the animator slot. Elephant AOC in there. So we're going to reiterate a couple of slides this time because I'm lame and I went too fast. In the prefabs folder, we selected the elephant. We created an animator override controller in the animation folder. And we renamed this elephant AOC, and we assigned the enemy AC as the controller to allow that to override. Oop, wrong one. There we go. And then in the models character folder, we expanded the elephant to see the clips, and we assigned idle, move, and death to the corresponding slots in that override table of animations, or table of states, I should say. Then finally, we've selected the elephant in the prefabs folder and assigned the animator override controller to the controller slot. So now we have 3 enemies that are set up and ready to be spawned into our game. So how do we do that?
Good question.
Good question. Okay, so we need some kind of manager object. So much like our score manager or anything else, we want to have an individual object that is in charge of the spawning of the enemies, how frequent it is, etc. So we like to keep things neat here, so we're going to create a brand new object to manage this on. You could, like any script, you can attach this to any object you want to. You could attach it to the environment, you could attach it to the camera or anything you expect to stay in the game, but we're not going to. We're going to create an empty game object. There's not really any overhead or any problem doing it this way, and it allows us to keep things modular and separate. And the great thing about this, of course, is that if we wanted to make this a prefab, we could drop this into another level and reuse it. So I'm going to go to the hierarchy this time and go to create empty and create an empty game object. I'm going to rename this enemy manager.
It's a good habit to get into, by the way, when creating a new game object or empty game object or whatever, to ensure that it's at 000, it's at the origin. just in case you might be using it as a container for other things and you don't want it to change the coordinates of child objects and stuff. If you create it, well, okay, in this case it did not. Usually when you create it through the drop-down in the hierarchy, it just puts it at 0, 0, 0. It's just a good habit to get into. You don't have to do it, but it's one of those things that it might save you some confusion in the later when you're like, why are things moving around? And that's why. So just something to keep in mind. It's a good habit to do.
Yep. So I've reset the position to 0. Then, very kindly, we've prepared a script that will do this for you. So in the scripts folder under managers, you will find enemy manager, and you can simply drag and drop onto the enemy manager. So just to show you one other way of assigning a script, you can either drop it onto the name in the hierarchy, you can also drop it onto empty space in the list of components in the inspector.
We're all about options.
So I'm going to double click the name of that script to open it up, and it looks like this. So this is quite a simple script, this one. It's got a bunch of public variables that need assigning. So because this script is something we're going to use several times and assign different enemies, different spawn points to, we're not going to want to use the script to find those. We're going to want to use the editor to drag and drop all of these things. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So you see a lot of public variables up front. The first thing, of course, is a reference to the player health. We're going to want to check that we're only going to spawn more enemies if the player health is more than 0. And then we need a reference to the game object of the enemy that we want to spawn. So those prefabs are effectively game objects that are stored as an asset. So we have a reference to the particular one we want to spawn. Then we have a spawn time, which is 3 seconds. And obviously, because it's public, we'll be tweaking this, changing it to balance the game. And then we have a public transform array. So you note these two open, closed square brackets called spawn points. So the reason that this is an array rather than a single transform, and just for those who don't know, an array is effectively a list of the same thing. The transform, we want a list of different spawn points. We're not going to use that in this example. We're going to use one spawn point per instance of this manager. But if you wanted to, you could have a whole bunch of spawn points, and you can take this project away and create more spawn points and try it out and have fun with it. So we just wanted to give you that option. So when the game starts, we use a function called invoke repeating. And what that does is it basically means you don't need to have a timer effectively for something that's going to repeat. So from the very start of the game, we call the spawn function. So we name it as a string, and we have an amount of time to wait before doing it, and we have an amount of time to wait before repeating it. We've just reused spawn time. We could set that to 0, but we've just reused it, so there's a bit of a breathing space at the start of the game. So invoke repeating will just repeat this every, 3 seconds. And we're checking if the player has some health, and if he doesn't, we return. But if he does, if he's still alive and kicking, then we are going to instantiate our enemy into the game. So we have this integer called spawn point index. Now when you create an array, a list of things, an integer is there to represent the point in the array. So as Mike mentioned earlier, any kind of list of things, anything time a computer counts, it starts at 0. So this is the index. The index is the number in the list as an integer. So we want to pick a particular spawn point and spawn from that point. This way, if you do choose to use an array, a number of different spawn points, then it will pick a random one to spawn at, making the game a bit more lively. So the way that we pick a random one is we say random.range. We start at 0 and we pick any number up to the length, so the final number of spawn points. So it will pick any of those spawn points.
It can help to think of an array as like an accordion folder, if you guys know what that is, right? Just a folder with a whole bunch of slots in it. It's still really one folder, right? That's what an array is. It's just one variable. But if you open it, you've got a whole bunch of slots inside. And that's effectively how an array behaves. You can look at the first slot, the second, the third, and the fourth, and you can put stuff in there. So an array of these spawn points is just a single object, a single array of those spawn points. But if you open it up, you can see all of the various ones inside of it. And that's what we're doing, is we're just picking a random one, pulling that out, and saying that's our spawn point.
Yeah, and we're reusing that information. So we're saving that as a number. So we're picking a number and saving it into that variable. And the reason we do that is because of this instantiate line. So instantiate just means create an instance of something. So it spawns, effectively, is another word for it. And it has 3 properties: the thing to spawn, where to spawn it, and what rotation it should have when it's created. So the first one is obviously the enemy, the one that we assign to our public variable, and we'll do that shortly. And then the second one is using that spawn points array, and we're passing into the square brackets which point in the array. So if I was to pass in 0, it would choose the first transform that we drag and drop into our list. But we're going to allow it to use the random one that it's just picked. So every time spawn runs, it will pick a random number within that list of different spawn points, pass it in to the position and rotation. So remember that this is a transform, and every transform has a position and a rotation. So that is very simply our enemy manager. I'm going to switch back to Unity now. And
PowerPoint.
Indeed. Just to recap, we created an empty game object to house our enemy manager. In the scripts folder, we applied the enemy manager script onto that game object so that it's ready to roll. And you'll see when we go back in just a second that we are able to apply all of those things.
I'll do this better.
Okay.
All right, so thank you. So we have this enemy manager game object now, and we have this enemy manager script on it. And as kind of was hinted at, this enemy manager script was built to be kind of modular, which means we can put a bunch on, we can take a bunch off, we can have a bunch of spawn points, kind of future-proofing this game, so you guys can keep adding to it and stuff like that. Before we actually start putting in the actual enemies and getting them spawning, though, we have to generate these spawn points where the enemies are going to appear at. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a spawn point for our Zombunny. And we're going to do that. And also, if you can still see the animator window here, we're just going to click back over to scene view because we don't really need the animator view anymore. No, thank you. And so what I'm going to do is, again, I'm just going to create, and I'm going to create an empty by clicking the create dropdown in the hierarchy view. And this empty game object is going to be my Zombunny spawn point. As such, I'm going to name it Zombunny spawn point. We're all about creativity. That's not right at all. What did I do? I added a bunch of icons there. There we go. Your keyboard is slightly different than mine.
Yeah.
So we have a Zombunny spawn point, all right? And we can see it where it kind of exists right now, but that's not really where we want it to go. And so what we want to do is we want to place this where we want the Zombunnies to come from. Now, as was hinted previously, we could have a bunch of different spawn points, but we're only going to have one per enemy for now. And as we move around in our scene, we can see the spawn point where it is right now with these little arrows to denote where it is in the scene. But we can also give a customized icon to this object, so it becomes much easier to see it in the scene view. And it's really easy to do. So I'm going to ensure that Zombunny spawn point is selected in my hierarchy, and then I'm going to look at the top of the inspector, and we see this little colored cube right here at the top of the inspector. And if I click that, I get a drop-down that gives me all these sorts of options. And using this, I can pick an icon. Now, the Zombunny is blue, so I could pick the blue, or I really could pick whatever I want, but I'm going to pick blue so they're color coordinated. And so now that I've selected that, if I look back in my scene view, I'm going to see that Zombunny spawn point has a name with this icon around it, right? So it's very easy now to see exactly where that is. It stands out. And now that it's more easy to see, I'm going to go ahead and position it. Now, I'm going to supply the coordinates and rotation to position these. This is one of those things where it's a really good idea to supply the exact values that we provide, only because these spawn points are kind of behind bits of geometry, inside of mouse holes, like that. So if you're off a little bit, your enemies are going to start spawning in walls, right? And they're not going to be able to come out, and it's going to be kind of problematic, especially in like the mouse hole, which has a very narrow opening. So it's very important to get these numbers pretty much exactly as we have them. So for the Zombunny spawn point, we're going to do the position, the x value of the position to be negative 20.5. We are going to have the y value be 0, and the z value is going to be 12.5. We are then going to provide a rotation, which is 0 in the x-axis, 130 in the y-axis, and 0 in the z-axis. So you should end up with these values, and we'll pull up the PowerPoint here to reiterate because they're nice and color-coded. So what we did is we created an empty game object, and we renamed it Zombunny spawn point. At the top of the inspector, we set the gizmo for the Zombunny spawn point as that little oval icon and set its color to blue. We then made the position of the spawn point negative 20.5, 0, and 12.5 with a rotation of 0 in the x-axis, 130 in the y-axis, and 0 in the z-axis. Again, fairly important that you have those numbers, kind of how we have them, otherwise your enemies might be running into walls and not spawning where you need them to spawn. Okay. So now we have the Zombunny spawn point, and it's where we want it. And if I look in the scene view, there it is. I can see it. It's much easier to see now because it has that blue icon. So let's go ahead and create our Zombear spawn point. Okay. Now again, I can right-click, create new, and stuff like that. But in this instance, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate the one I've already made. And so I can click on the Zombunny spawn point in the scene, and I can right-click and select duplicate, or I can simply click on it in the hierarchy and hit Command-D on a Mac, Control-D on a PC. And that's going to create an exact duplicate. Same name, same icon, same position, same everything. All right? Now, we have this as a duplicate, so let's go ahead and change it slightly. I'm going to rename it from Zombunny spawn point to Zombear spawn point. And I'm going to change its gizmo, again, using the drop-down in the inspector. I'm going to change it from a blue oval to a sort of fuchsia oval, since the Zombear is kind of pink. And then I'm going to change its position and its rotation. Again, it's fairly important to have these accurate. Mine is going to be 22.5 in the x-axis, 0 in the y-axis, and 15 in the z-axis. The rotation of this is going to be 0 in the x-axis, 240 in the y-axis, and 0 in the z-axis. So, to kind of reiterate, we duplicated, so I didn't actually follow these steps. We duplicated the Zombunny spawn point and renamed it Spawnbear, but if you had wanted to, you could have created an empty game object and renamed it Zombear. Either would have been fine. At the top of the inspector, we set the gizmo for the spawn or Zombear spawn point to a fuchsia or pink color. We set its position to 22.5, 0, 15 with a rotation of 0, 240, 0. Now, we've created two. Let's go ahead and create the last one. We're going to do the elephant. And the steps are going to be very similar. So with Zombear selected, again, I'm just going to click press Control-D or Command-D, or right-click and select duplicate. It's just going to make a duplicate of that object. And we're going to rename it from Zombear spawn point to be elephant spawn point. Once created, again, in the inspector, I'm going to click the gizmo, and this time I'm going to choose a yellow gizmo because the elephant has that yellow stripe to it. And then I'm going to set its position to be 0 in the x-axis, 0 in the y-axis, 32 in the z-axis. I will then set its rotation to be 0 in the x-axis, 230 in the y-axis, and 0 in the z-axis. And so if we now look at our scene view in a zoomed out way, we can see all three of our spawn points. We can see exactly where our enemies are going to be coming from once we have the enemy manager able to start spawning those. So again, let's pull up the PowerPoint here. We went ahead, in this case, again, we didn't follow exactly. What we did is we duplicated the Zombear spawn point, renamed it elephant spawn point. We gave it a yellow gizmo in the inspector. We set its position to 0, 0, 32. We set its transform rotation to 0, 230, 0. At this point, we have our 3 spawn points, we have our 3 enemy prefabs, we have our enemy manager, we have our player. We've got everything we need to sort of put it all together and get these enemies spawning. All right.
So we're just going to set up the first of 3 instances of the enemy manager to spawn our Zombunny. So if you click back on your enemy manager, you will see your enemy manager script, and that's set up there ready to go, but we have 2 things to fill in. Go for it,
Or
Mike.
maybe 3.
Okay. Or maybe 3. Yeah, 3. That's
Possibly.
Good point.
Maybe 4. Who knows?
Yeah.
And so what we want to do, the first thing we need to fill in is we see player health. Again, we don't want our enemy manager to spawn enemies when the player is dead. Right? There's really no point. And so what we're going to do is we're going to locate the player, and we're going to click and drag onto the player health property of the enemy manager. And that's going to locate the player health script so that it only spawns at the appropriate times. Then we have this next section for enemy. This is the enemy that's going to spawn. But if I look in my scene, I don't have any enemies. Right? There are none. I look in my cupboard, my enemy cupboard, and there bear. So what we need to do is we need to specify, well, what enemy are we going to spawn? We don't have any objects here. Luckily, as Will has already mentioned, because he's classy like that, is the prefabs are in fact game objects. So if we look down in the prefabs folder, we will notice our enemies, right? We'll notice our Zombunny and our Zombear and our Elephant are there. And they are prefabs. They don't exist in the scene, but they are still game objects. And as such, as Will is about to demonstrate rather keenly, we can click and drag them into the enemy property on our enemy manager script. And now it knows that it's going to instantiate or create copies of that Zombunny prefab. Now we can see spawn time is 3. What that means is when our game starts, it's going to wait 3 seconds and then spawn a Zombunny. And then it's going to wait 3 more seconds and spawn a Zombunny, and so on and so forth, over and over and over again. All right? But it still doesn't know where to spawn those, right? We have the script, we have the player, we have the enemy, we have the time. But if we actually expand this spawn points, we will see size 0. Remember, this is an array, right? It's a collection, right? We haven't given it anything yet. So its size is 0. There's nothing in here. Now, there's a lot of manual ways I can add to this, but there's actually also a really simple way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ensure that spawn points is actually collapsed, right? I don't want to see size or anything like that. I want it to be collapsed. And then I'm simply going to locate Zombunny spawn point and click and drag it onto the name spawn points, not down here anywhere. You will see on my mouse, if you look at my screen, when I'm clicking drag and I move over the spawn points, I get this green plus icon. If I let go now, it's added to this collection. If I had a bunch of spawn points, I can click and drag each one to the name, and it will automatically add them to the collection. So at this point, if I run this, it will start spawning Zombunnies.
Yep. So we've done a couple of slides there, so just to reiterate. So our enemy manager in the hierarchy needed the player health script assigning to the enemy manager, because it uses that to check that the player hasn't died already and only spawns if we haven't died. From the prefabs folder, we needed to assign the Zombunny as the particular enemy that we wanted.
Turn your mics off.
Oh. Okay.
Butterfly flapped its wings in Korea.
Oh no. Now that that's done, we then added, we made sure the spawn time's set to 3. We knew that was already set, so we didn't mention that. And then the other thing that we did was to assign the Zombunny spawn point from the hierarchy onto the title of the array, which will automatically resize that array. As Mike mentioned, if we'd assigned several different spawn points and dragged and dropped them on, it would have scaled it for us. The size would read a different number, and they'd be listed. So, with that done, without further ado, we are going to save our scene and press play. And what we should see...
You're going to have to wait like 3 seconds plus.
yeah, is that when we head over to our Zombunny spawn point,
Oh my god, they just keep coming.
they keep coming.
Oh, hey, it would help if we showed you what was on the screen, right?
Sweet. Good
You didn't
catch,
miss
one
anything
person.
important. You know, it wasn't. We meant to do that. We meant to do that. I want to see if you're paying attention.
Hands up if you have any problems with that part.
Hands up if you've got problems. People will come around and help.
Okay, let's crack swiftly on. So we've put one instance of the enemy manager. We designed this script to be modular so that you could reuse it. We've done this, we could have written a script that had arrays of different enemies and arrays for different spawn points. We just made this nice and simple. What that means is you can drag on more than one copy of this script onto your enemy manager and assign the other game objects. So what I'm going to do is to go back to my script managers folder and drag on another copy of enemy manager. So I can just drag into that empty space and let go. Then, as before, I need to assign my player to player health, and I need to assign an enemy. So this time I'm going to choose from prefabs, Zombear. And I'm going to drag my Zombear spawn point and drop it onto the spawn points array, which will populate it. So if you're super savvy, you can do that one more time for the elephant. I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. So finally, one more time, scripts managers, enemy manager, drop it on again, the third and final time, and we're going to assign the player to get the player health script. We're going to go into our prefabs folder, drag and drop the elephant game object. This time we'll set a different spawn time to 10, and we're going to drag our elephant spawn point onto the spawn points array. So I'm going to leave that, instead of going to the slides this time, I'm going to leave that open like that. So we've effectively given it 3 copies of the same script. We've assigned different enemies to spawn and different spawn points to spawn them from. And we can choose different spawn times. So if we want a spawn time of 10 for the elephant, we get fewer of them. So it's kind of like a tank kind of class if you played Left 4 Dead. And then we've populated it exactly the same way as we did before. And you can just go ahead, press save, press play, and you then have your spawners for each thing. And you'll have different enemies coming from those different spawn points that we set up, coming from different directions. So go ahead and save and play, and you should be able to play 3 enemy-based game.
All right, let me see how I can do here. Are you going to play?
Yeah.
All right, fine. It's a hog the game. That's cool.
Feel free.
No, I'm just go ahead.
Go on.
All right.
So remember that we put different spawn points in different places. The Zombunny is coming from behind the doll's house. The Zombear is coming out of the mouse hole. And the elephants are coming from behind the chest of drawers in the upper corner of the game. And your score should be working, and if they manage to corner you, you should be losing health.
We really should have made you lose health if you stepped on the Legos, because stepping on Legos hurts so much.
Yeah. So that was the end of phase 9. We have one more phase to go.